full panel. A quick little rundown. I'll just quickly introduce them, and then before each presentation, I'll give their bio. We got Charli, Beck, we got Renfrick, and Simone Ciglia, right? Ciglia. But all right, let's start with Charli. Charli Beck is a critical studies and visual studies student at the Pacific Northwest College of Art. Charli is an emerging scholar and artist residing in Oregon. Her work asks questions about human-land relations, ecology, and conceptions of time, as well as seeking ways to embody and enact decoloniality while living on stolen land. Recently, she has published arts writing in the Chiaroscuro literary journal and illustration work with Trails magazine. Currently, she is considering glacial ice, harnessing the metaphorical power of the migration of clouds, and interrogating joyful labor through sheep shearing, pulling weeds, and digging holes. Charli.
Thank you, Lowen. I'm panicking, so thanks for being here. It's weird to hear my bio read out loud. Okay, hi, hello, welcome. I guess I'll just go to my slides. So my presentation is called Thistles and Wool, Seeking Reciprocity with Land in Ranch Management. As I was writing this, it was kind of evolving the whole time, so we'll see where we ended up, and if you have questions, I probably have them too, so I'm excited to talk after. Speaking of questions, I exist in a state of constant intrigue and question asking, so when I write a paper, I'm actually just like asking more questions back to back. So we're gonna go through a little jaunt through some rampant curiosities, and we'll see where we arrive at. With thistles and sheep as entry points, I'm interrogating the connections between ranchers and their livestock and the land upon which both depend. I hope to contribute to and bring together existing conversations surrounding land management and human-nature relationships toward the practice of more equitable ways of being in and of the world. So I would just like to start with a quick little positionality statement. I am working with Indigenous knowledge in this research, and I am not Indigenous to this land. So just wanting to acknowledge that we are living on traditional homeland sites of Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tualatin, Kalapuya, Molalla, bands of Chinook, and many other Indigenous peoples who are still living and working here today. I am seeking their knowledge with humility and intentions toward connection and deep listening. My work is grounded in and heavily influenced by Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a Potawatomi botanist and author. I am drawn by the understanding that living in a place for millennia gives people a deep understanding of that place and how to live there well. My words are too small. In pursuing this research, I intend to integrate different ways of knowing in an effort to interrogate how all of us can find the best possible practices for sustainably living together. I welcome feedback on my approach. In this, ooh, that got loud. Did I do that? Where did I go? Sorry, y'all. I'm very nervous. In this research, oh, okay. It bloomed all of a sudden. Thank you, Stacy. I'm coming to realize that the type of work I'm doing might fall into a category of multi-species autoethnography. I'm not an ecologist or a rancher, although I'm curious about those things, and my inquisition is coming from inside of myself, and that is the story you're going to hear. I utilize narratives of personal interactions with ranchers in Oregon to ground my research in storytelling and real-world experiences. My strategy for inquiry is to be in relationship with those on the ground as much as possible. I'm spending time on ranches and land trust sites, learning what sort of tools are currently in use and building an understanding of existing perspectives and goals. The multi-species part of multi-species ethnography, it comes in when I start thinking about sheep and thistles and grasses and clouds. Maybe clouds aren't a species, but what if they were? I'm thinking about a perspective described by Bruno Latour in Reassembling the Social, which insists that non-humans have a type of agency that is more open than the traditional natural causality when it comes to affecting how systems exist and function. I'm choosing to think from a place where we statements attempt to envelop all aspects of materiality and relationality. So I'd like to just jump into the perspectives that my research is currently looking at and drawing from. I'm looking in particular to this little pocket of thought that I think exists between traditional ecological knowledge, new materialism, and regenerative agriculture. It's been curious for me to hear similar sentiments expressed by people across these fields. Writers often touch on things that come up in the other fields while talking about their own field. And I argue that they're doing really similar work with just slightly different perspectives and varied use of language. I believe that if the work can be brought together and more broadly demonstrated, it could be utilized more intentionally in large-scale land management operations, ranging from restoration ecology to industrial agriculture. And that work is already happening, and I'm learning that in my research, but it's not necessarily being called out at each of these frameworks. And I'd like to just continue to bring them together and help to map out the interconnections of this interconnective thinking. Again, I'm inspired by Robin Wall Kimmerer, but also many thinkers, scientists, writers, including Sarah Souther, Helen Wybrow, Timothy Morton, Donna Haraway, Karen Barad, Judith D. Schwartz, and many others who might not be named in this presentation, but are very much alive in the networks of my exploration. With their guidance, I'm constructing frameworks to understand the multitude of complexities at play. Starting with a relationship is foundational for this work, and moving outward from our grounding perspectives, I'd like to tell you a little story regarding my arrival to this triangle of thought. It's a story about how I somehow went to grad school to become a sheep shearer, and about how when all the ranchers find out that I'm in grad school, they ask, "What the hell are you doing here?" Which is a fair question, though I would argue that peeling lanolin-soaked canvas pants off of bruised legs at the end of a hot day from wrestling woolly beasts is in itself an art form. Anyway, I'm going to fast forward through a lot of that original personal story and skip to the part where I remembered that this whole endeavor is about land too, and how we are more a part of the landscapes we move through than we sometimes recognize, how they are part of us too. This particular glimpse comes from some talk I heard about thistles. Bull thistle, milk thistle, Scotch thistle, Canada thistle, welted thistle, they're all over the place and the sheep won't eat them. They're coming up I-5 in the hay. I told him he's got to clean his cap before he moves it, but he doesn't listen. I was intrigued to be present for this conversation, though only adjacent to it, between ranchers in the shearing trailer at the end of sheep shearing school. I went to learn to give a sheep a haircut and stayed to learn more about the ranchers' day-to-day. I was intrigued by the ways these folks understand the land that supports their livelihoods and what they do to support the land in return. It's a two-way deal. You won't have well-fed sheep if you let plants that the sheep won't eat take over your pasture. It sounds, I know, a little one-sided, but I think it really is about supporting a balance. Wandering down this thought path brought me to a key word for today: reciprocity. I know in the wake of Robin Wall Kimmerer's amazing work, this word became a bit of a buzzword, and I hope you'll stick with me through this interrogation, because I believe the buzzword phenomenon is based on need. When we start talking too much about a word, it is symptomatic of some work needing to be done collectively. It's easier to talk than to work, and so the word circulates until we don't feel like talking about it anymore. So I want to revisit this word and talk about some of the work that might truly entail and how these fields I mentioned are approaching it. A lovely description that contains a subtle prescription comes from Sogorea-Te Land Trust, an indigenous historical village and burial site doing community work on traditional Lisjan Ohlone land in what is now the East Bay area of California. According to Sogorea-Te, reciprocity is when you take care of something and it takes care of you in balance. Nested in this definition are two words that I want us to hold on to: care and, again, balance. So we'll talk a little bit about traditional ecological knowledge. The idea of care and balance care and support in balance comes up a lot in my research into traditional ecological knowledge, also just talked about as TEK. TEK is a way of thinking, a lens, a way of life, an approach to living. It is often juxtaposed with the term scientific ecological knowledge, or SEK. And while there does seem to be a clear contrast, work is being done to find the overlaps between the two, or the ways in which each perspective has something different or complementary to offer toward the same goals. I encountered a lot of valuable information about this interplay in a 2023 article titled "Integrating Traditional Ecological Knowledge into U.S. Public Land Management" by Sarah Souther, Sarah Colombo, and Nanaba N. Linden. These three scholars essentially performed a thorough and beautiful literature review that also contains a clear and supported argument, and it taught me a lot. My favorite takeaway from the paper's overview is that the idea that TEK is as much a cultural process as an environmental one. The authors write, "Mismanagement of public lands could trigger irrevocable cultural loss, since language, traditions, and spiritual practices are often tied to particular species and ecosystems." The authors go on to describe the ways that generations of people living in integrated and observational relation with their environment has shaped culture as much as it has shaped land, to the extent they argue that the two are actually inseparable. Another key takeaway from Souther's article that is particularly valuable to my research is the clarifying statement that any group of people routinely interacting with the environment for extended time periods develop TEK, though the term often refers specifically to indigenous traditional ecological knowledge, or ITEK. The authors explain that some of the nuances of terminology and how context is important to semiotic choices. I believe this distinction does really help things for us. First, of course, is that it reminds us to recognize those who came before us and to honor their wisdom and experience and to learn from them. Second is the suggestion that we can all come to learn the ways of a place, provided that we are able to sit with it in an honest and prolonged relationship. Farmers and ranchers know their land like family. They know the climate and the subtle ways it is shifting and what it means for them and how they need to adjust and adapt. To know in this way requires presence and attention that is becoming more and more rare and may even be missing entirely for many larger scale agricultural operations. When I heard those sheep ranchers talking about thistles with such specificity, the evidence of intimate environmental knowledge built through their experience of the place was enlivening. I want to advocate for that kind of deep attention at every scale. There is a perfect description of this in Judith D. Schwartz's book, Reindeer Chronicles. In the book, Schwartz visits Hawaii and meets with farmer Koa Hewa, who tells her, "We respect nature as our grandparents. When you're from a place for multiple generations, you can recognize patterns, even when we see changes in cycle patterns." When you're from a place for multiple generations, you can recognize patterns, and when we see changes in cycle patterns, we are able to forecast change ahead of time. We've been working this way for thousands of years. Many of us on this land are a few thousand years behind, but I want us to learn to see the family of things. This summer, a colleague from the Colville tribe in northeastern Washington shared in a land acknowledgement the sentiment that we do not own the land, we are of the land. This statement has stuck with me as a precise picture of this way of seeing the world. The notion of being of the land is echoed in New Materialism by scholar Karen Barad, who writes, "We do not obtain knowledge by standing outside of the world. We know because we are of the world. We are part of the world in its differential becoming." This notion of differential becoming is part of Barad's theory of agential realism, in which all elements of the material universe are equally responsible for the happenings that arise out of their relations. We are the world, and we are making the world. Barad writes about this idea of quantum entanglement that comes from particle physics, but they apply it socially here to suggest that matter is fundamentally connected in ways that we cannot escape. We are affecting and being affected by everything else always. Writers in this field invite us to reach for new conclusions about where one entity ends and the next begins, the suggestion being that there is not really a clear division. The power here lies in shifting our approach to matter. We can see that all of what makes and surrounds us is us. We can then shift the way we interpret how we relate to all things. This philosophical approach to the world attempts to break down such familiar binaries as the nature-culture divide, as well as subject-object and human-non-human. Rather than individual identities, we can picture instead a series of moments in which various elements of the continuousness of existence identify themselves, ourselves, while remaining enmeshed. Looking through this philosophical lens of connection can open our minds to the entanglement that Karen Barad speaks to. This is truly quite in line with the inseparability of our being from everything that surrounds us that is seen in traditional ecological knowledge's approach to relation. Taking these two approaches hand in hand and applying this view of relationship to agricultural activities can lead us toward regenerative agriculture. Sustainable Northwest tells us that regenerative ranching is a way to produce food in harmony with nature. The focus is on the soil because healthy soil is the foundation for everything. Healthy soil stores water and carbon, naturally filters the water, and supports diverse plants and wildlife. This way of working already popped up when we met Koa Hewa Hewa, who was working on a regenerative farm in Hawaii, growing fruits, utilizing succession planting, among other tactics, to work with the ways that nature had told generations before him it wants to work. So already it begins to feel that the two approaches, TEK and regenerative agriculture, are inherently linked. Ranching generally may at first appear to be necessarily an extractive model, but I believe the knowledge that many land managers operate under is based on an understanding of the need for reciprocity as a tool for continuation. We see it with Hewa Hewa, and we see it with the sheep ranchers' recognition of the arrival of new plants to their pastures and the potential problems of such arrivals. An interesting distinction in approaches comes up in Robin Wall Kimmerer's book, A Democracy of Species, where she writes about a colleague who was seeking support to attend a sustainability conference. The colleague was told by her tribal council that sustainability is actually a profit-oriented word. It is not reciprocity, and if they send her to the conference, she needs to express that distinction. I appreciate that sentiment and want to continue to look toward alternative approaches to the existing agricultural models to replace a sustainability mode of capital with a reciprocity model of nourishment. In many places where these relational and traditional knowledges have been suppressed, humans working land have created a scenario in which the land has been overworked to the point of exhaustion. I'm advocating for a complete overhaul of large-scale extractive agricultural models through an intentional shift in perspectives that involves the embrace of traditional knowledges, the application of philosophical lenses, and a closeness of attention and affection for the land. I want to see more intentional support for the land that supports us. I know this is a bit pie in the sky in our current profiteering culture, but I'm intrigued and encouraged by the depth of understanding that does exist around this topic across a broad variety of fields. As I continue to explore the realms of sheep and of plants in my own life and studies, I am moving forward with an intentional eye toward relation and interconnection. I hope that my own actions can lend themselves to an expansion of these deeper understandings across the spaces that I find myself in. I invite you to explore this as well. And just a tiny closing aside, I would like to clarify that lots of thistles are native to this place, and because the ecosystem is adapted to them, they're not harmful in the ways that new interlopers are. So please hold space in your imagination for these guys who look like the other guys but are not. Though we have not had a deep dive into plant ID, just know that this is not an anti-thistle rampage. Thank you.
Thank you, Charli. Over here, to your left. Up next, we have Ren. Ren is a poet, artist, community organizer, and independent scholar. They hold an MA in English with a focus in public engagement from the University of Nevada, Reno. Their research explores the intersections of queer ecologies, asexuality studies, and the practice of mutual aid to further conversations on the complexities of care, intimacy, pleasure, and interrelationality. Through such exploration, they play with the conceptual lenses of asexual ecologies and ecologies of care. Their writing on asexual ecologies is forthcoming in the edition collection Practices of Witnessing, Field Notes for Climate Rhetorics, and they are assembling their poetry chapbook, Secret Third Thing, It's Still Love.
All right, thank you, Lowen. Okay, cool. Hi, everyone. So I'm from Reno, so I'm meeting people as I'm here, and this is fantastic. And thank you for having me. And a little bit about me, just kind of to like condense that bio into something, I don't know, better, cooler. I'm a queer ace-spec human. I run the Reno Community Art Closet in Reno, so we redistribute new and gently used art supplies and collaborate with a lot of mutual aid groups there. I'm a poet, multimedia artist, and then like the biggest thing, I'm a community member in Reno. And so I have photos of my community and the people who teach me so much, who I learned so much with, who, like, we feed each other, we house each other, we make sure people in our community are fed and housed, and I couldn't do the work that I do without them, and I'm very, very, very grateful for that. Okay. Is that better? Oh my gosh, that's so much better. Okay. Cool. So moving forward, just a little overview of what's about to come. We'll talk a little bit about relationships with air, and then from there we'll think about how we can learn, what we can learn from air and wind. And then as we do that, we'll arrive ideally at a definition of asexual ecologies. And so as I was working on this, I was thinking about how other people think about wind, just to kind of situate like what the conversations are, things like that. And I found Thomas Jackson's work, and he does these really cool tool installations. And wind is really, really essential in these pieces, right? So I was curious, like, what does he think about wind and wind's role in that? So to quote him, he said, "In the past, I viewed the wind as a threat to my outdoor installations, which are often quite fragile. But in 2020, I embraced California's strong offshore breezes as my artistic collaborator, the force that could transform lifeless scraps of fabric into fast-moving brush fires, rolling fog murmurations, or other natural phenomena." So I took that, and I was thinking about wind as collaborator, which is how I get wind as co-collaborator in assembling an asexual ecology. And then I also looked to other elemental relations. So what does wind's relationship with water look like? What does wind's relationship with fire look like? What does wind's relationship with land and other land structures look like? And then I was thinking about atmosphere, and like air is all around us. So what does that look like? So that's kind of my like cue up into where I was assembling things from, and how that informs what I'm about to share with you all. So to begin, I have a couple questions I want you all to sit with and think about as I speak. So I invite you to take a moment and consider your relationship to air. What calls air into your consciousness? How does it command your attention? How long does it hold your attention for? How might you play with air? And then the main guiding question is, how can we use elemental thinking, so in this case thinking with air, alongside queerness to imagine new ways of being and relating? So sit with those questions, and we'll think about how the elements in queerness have a lot in common. They're categorizable, yet they're boundless and elusive. They're inherent and known and ever-evolving. To engage in elemental thinking is to challenge the division between what is considered life and what is considered non-life through the unpredictability and the elusiveness of the elements. Elemental thinking unravels binaries and finds the spaces beyond and the spaces in between. Together, elemental thinking and queerness create new ways of being and new landscapes through a plurality of relationships. So this piece functions in 3 ways. The first and foremost is to begin to fill the noticeable gap on asexuality within the subfield of queer ecologies. There's not a lot out there. So I was like, well, I'll do it. I got it. So that was the first thing. The second thing is, this is a response to KJ Sarankowski's call for a radical shift in how we perceive of absence and presence, in which absence and presence can be co-constituted to further resist colonial logics of erasure and romanticize fantasies of the natural. And then very recently, the first piece on ace ecologies came out by Dr. Ella Cibolo. And so from her beginnings on ace ecologies, she situates them as a means of, and I quote, providing tools for thinking more dynamically about both what sex is and the vagueness of sex and sexuality in relation to non-human kin. So that's the conversation in the field. And so to begin, I locate queer ecologies at the juncture of elemental thinking and queerness, bringing in air and wind alongside asexuality and asexual ways of existing and relating to co-construct an asexual ecology. To do this work, I enlist the help of air, a seemingly invisible element to think alongside asexuality, which is a sexuality that is very often reduced to a definition of lack or absence. Air's activated form, wind, functions as a guidepost for challenging compulsory sexuality and what it means to be intimate with something or someone. Air and wind and their interelemental relations and intimacies resist what KJ Sarankowski refers to as the, quote, productive end that is not only sought out in colonized forms of relation with the elements, so mining, energy production, any sort of colonial way of engaging with the earth that is very resource extraction focused. But also sex. When we think about what sex is like, there's that focus on orgasm, that productive end, right? So by employing an asexual lens when thinking with air and wind, or to begin to consider an asexual ecology, we can begin to seek out the presence and absence and consider or reconsider what it means to seek out a productive end and challenge our conceptualizations and expectations of not only our relationships with the elements and the natural world, but with each other. So let's first start with air. Air is an enveloping element. It surrounds us, it holds us, it keeps us alive. And while we are aware that air, and not just air, but healthy, clean air, is essential to supporting air-breathing life, we may also tend to assume that air is always present, whether or not it actively takes up space in our consciousness. Being immersed in an atmosphere makes it difficult to recognize or sense that envelopment. But when air or atmosphere often does become present, generally it's because there is an association of harm. So wildfire smoke, some sort of natural disaster, tornadoes, toxins, air pollution, or when it is interacting with other entities, so wind interacting or air interacting with water, or land, or our own bodies. Following a similar pattern of thought, sex and the ideologies surrounding it envelop us too. We can think about sex as a life-sustaining force when we think about reproduction. But compulsory sexuality, or the dominant way of understanding human sexuality and desire that assumes all individuals feel a sexual attraction to the same extent and that everyone desires and seeks out sexual relationships, permeates our everyday existence. And this is where asexuality troubles things. As a sexual orientation, asexuality is often reduced to a definition of lack or absence of sexual attraction and desire, ultimately denying the nuance and the multiplicity of meaningful experiences that asexual people partake in. There's that presence in the absence. And when we actively think about asexuality and we think about air, neither of them are nothingness, nor do their perceived absences nullify their existence. Air, as an enveloping element, can take on everythingness, and that everythingness is shaped by air's relationality, interactions, and intimacies with outside forces and other elements. And asexuality, too, can do the same. Individuals who find themselves on the asexuality spectrum, or who are aspec, often have an increased proclivity toward understanding and prioritizing alternate forms of attraction, oftentimes building their relationships around these other forms of attraction. So by decentering both sexual attraction as the defining indicator of sexuality and sexual relating as the most sought out and fulfilling form of intimacy, provides an opportunity to further queer not only what it means to be in relation with someone or something, but also the depth of that relationship beyond what is traditionally seen. So now that we're thinking about air and asexuality in terms of presence rather than absence, let's bring in wind. Wind is a disruptor. It's an unsettler, a rearranger, an activator, a suppressor of what was. Through interelemental relations, a single gust can put out a nascent flame, or it can propel a wildfire. It can activate little ripples or momentous waves. It can erode landforms and move debris. Wind comes in, often a fleeting presence, and shifts what was once calm and settled and makes anew. We cannot see wind in its elemental form, but we know that it's there. And asexuality, too, is a disruptor. Asexuality challenges compulsory sexuality by not adhering to a norm that privileges sexual relationships and instead favors alternate forms of engaging in deep, fulfilling, lifelong relationships, intimacy, and pleasure that can include sex, and can be shifted, redefined, and released from their ties to that search for a productive end. Okay. So then taking what we've learned about air, from air about presence and absence, and what we've learned about wind and disruption, now we can begin to contemplate what might happen when we harness desire, pleasure, and the search for intimacy in ways that are not reliant on compulsory sexuality and its privileging of binaristic thinking. Asexual, sexual, or presence or absence. And to do so requires a reconsideration of the ways in which intimacy and relationships are defined for both humans and for non-humans. These reconsiderations are informed by the weaving of conversations within the asexuality studies field with wind and an effort to arrive at the formation of an asexual ecology. So to situate where the conversations are within asexuality studies, we can't talk about asexuality studies without talking about the erotic, which feels a little bit antithetical, admittedly, but that's where the conversation is. The asexuality studies field draws a lot from Audre Lorde's reconceptualization of the erotic in her essay, The Uses of the Erotic is Power. It's fundamental. And Lorde's reconceptualization of the erotic is rooted in power and feeling and fulfillment rather than sensation. So asexuality scholar Ella Cibolo draws heavily from Lordean erotics in her construction of what she deems an asexual erotic. To Cibolo, the asexual erotic, quote, allows us to get curious about modes of attraction, the sheer draw of one body to another, and the textures of relationality, hinged from hackneyed tropes of what love and intimacy should look like, unquote. Asexual erotics go beyond the sexual and invite us to consider the ways in which different forms of attraction emerge and how much power we give them. Asexual erotics then challenge what K.J. Sarankowski refers to as erotic time, which is where pleasure is something that's reachable, finite, and limited to specific intimacies. And you might also think about this in terms of like the sex escalator as a thing too. So to consider pleasure from an asexual lens and to engage with asexual pleasures and erotics is to see each experience of pleasure, whether it be sexual, non-sexual, somewhere in between, as one that need not appeal to a climactic end. Essentially, pleasure can exist for pleasure's sake. For example, within disability studies, there's a growing emphasis on care and care work as pleasure, emphasizing that care and pleasure can coexist, though not necessarily, as Leah Lakshmi notes, as, quote, orgasmically pleasurable. So taking the conversation on the erotic one step further, we can bring in Driscoll's sovereign erotics into the conversation. Driscoll defines the sovereign erotic as a, quote, a return to and or a continuation of the complex relationalities of gender and sexuality that are ever present in both the human and more than human world, but erased and hidden by colonial cultures, end quote. Sovereign erotics foreground the multiplicity of experiences of sexuality and gender as they are informed by indigenous and more than human perspectives. A sovereign erotic is a reclamation of the power of the erotic. So now, with pleasure and the erotic in mind, let's go back to wind and elemental thinking. Wind's interrelationalities are fleeting, yet they're ongoing. And its relationships with the other elements only become visible and known through and because of the other entity that wind is interacting with. So here, I like to think about wind's relationship with sand. And I grew up in Northwest Indiana, so we have sand dunes. So I think about sand dunes. So we have the sand dune called Mount Baldy, and it's a living sand dune, which means it migrates, it moves as the wind blows it, essentially, so it moves like millimeters every year. So gusts of wind will ripple across the body of the dune, causing the dune to move and rearrange its composing parts. And in large part because of wind, the dune it's never fully stagnant, nor is its relationship with wind ever confined to one framework. Mount Baldy is always yet to be, it's always becoming, as its identity is emerging as a result of its interactions and intimacies with wind. Okay, and so now, with all of these things in mind, we get to define an asexual ecology. An asexual ecology is one of profound intimacies. By rejecting ideologies of compulsory sexuality that deem alternate forms of intimacy and knowing and being in relation to be insufficient or merely a precursor to sex, a plurality of asexual intimacies can rise that both undo the hierarchy of intimacies and reject a productive end. So here we can think sex, we can think orgasm, we can think marriage, we can think monogamy, literally all of the things, and yet still allow space for pleasure and deep connection. Like wind and its relationships with other elements, these intimacies may be fleeting. They may not necessarily lead to anything momentous, but they're present and they're meaningful. Asexual ecologies can ask us to look to not only the prolonged intimacies between entities, but the fleeting pleasures and everything in between. They ask us to recognize interactions with both human and non-humans, not for their productivity or use, but rather for their ability to engage and interact and sustain relationality in a multitude of ways. To envision an asexual ecology, one in which invisible forms become visible, or rather, one in which invisible forms need not be solely visible or invisible, but recognized for their fleetingness, their blips of visibility and invisibility, is to reckon with notions of duration and finality and productivity. And doing so can help to create a world of deeper relations. Thank you.
Thank you, Ren. Lastly, yeah, your slides are right behind that. We have Simone. Simone is an art historian, curator, and critic, currently serving as a teaching professor in the Department of History of Art and Architecture at the University of Oregon. His areas of research focus on marginal spaces within contemporary art, with a particular emphasis on its intersections with agriculture, craft, utopian, and dystopian impulses. He has curated exhibitions internationally and writes for a variety of publications. He served as an assistant researcher at the Maxi National Museum of 21st Century Art in Rome. He holds a PhD in the history of contemporary art from the Sapienza University of Rome.
Hi, good afternoon, and thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Thank you to PNCA for hosting us. I'm delighted to be here. And again, positionality seems like a common theme, so I would like to start from that. As you've heard, I am originally from Italy. I moved here 5 years ago to teach VUO. But for me, the research that I was carrying from my place of origin, I brought it here, and I'm still working on that and expanding on those thinking about the intersection between contemporary art and agriculture. And in a way, everything started here. This place is called Pollinaria. It is an artist residency in the Abruzzo region, where I'm from, central Italy, in the countryside. And since 2008 invites contemporary artists that develop work intersecting art and science in this place to develop a project. And getting to know this place, the community, the artists that worked here, and the founder of this place, Gaetano Carboni, I started to be curious about this apparently incongruous relationship between contemporary art and agriculture or the rural, widely speaking. And so I started to investigate this topic, starting from the knowledge of this place and then expanding a research that ultimately ended up in a book called The Expanded Field. Obviously, I stole this definition from Rosalind Krauss, Art and Agriculture in Italy from the 1960s until today. And since that, 2016, this kind of expanded field that describes really a constellation of practices of contemporary artists that in various ways are engaging with farming, expanded both theoretically but also in the exhibitionary discourse with exhibitions that are growing related to these themes. And after this first foray, mostly theoretical and art historical, into this expanded field, I had the possibility of curating an exhibition which was stemming from the book after almost 10 years of writing the book. And so what I would like to do today with you is basically guiding you through this exhibition, which was held in Palazzo Collicola in Spoleto. It's again in central Italy. It is an historical palace that now serves as a museum for contemporary art, as often happens in Italy. And here I had the possibility of expanding on the research and continuing to think about these themes and organize this exhibition that intersected thematic sections with monographic rooms dedicated to some artists. So the first room of the museum was conceived as a sort of brain of the exhibition, bringing together a selection of key artists who between the 1960s and 1970s laid the foundation for defining this expanded field at the intersection of contemporary art and rurality. At the center of the room, Balla di Fieno, Bale of Hail by Pino Pascali serves as a ready-made emblematic of the artist's fascination with peasant civilization. As Barbara Tomasi notes, Pascali, quotes, reaffirms the ancient and stratified anthropological identity of the Mediterranean agrarian civilization, now confronted with the eruption of new factors deriving from paroxysmal industrial development, end of quote. And Pascali was part of the group of artists that the Italian critic Germano Celant gathered around the definition of arte povera, and that conceptually was also the beginning of the investigation of the book. Artists that reflected on the consequences of the miracolo economico, the Italian miracle, the transition from the still agrarian-based society to a fully industrialized country that happened in between the mid-1950s and the early 1960s. And for these artists that are commonly referred by the use of poor materials, that's the name of the meaning of the definition, it was actually a broader attempt to reconstruct the reconnection with the natural sphere that the industrialization damaged in many ways. And so they made it through different ways, the use of natural materials, plants, as you've seen, also starting operations of cultivation that ended up in the sculptures, such as the case of Giuseppe Penone. This was really a foundational moment for a shift in the understanding of the rurality in contemporary art, from the sphere of representation to the use of active natural materials. And so that was also the beginning of the exhibition, ideally, that was somehow introduced in this room, where also other artists were featured, and I'm talking about Gianfranco Baruchello and Joseph Beuys, both of whom carried out the research of the Arte Povera in a way conceiving agriculture as an artistic practice. So not simply the use of natural material, but the actual action of farming as an artwork. And to these two artists that are kind of pivotal in this story in the mid-1970s were also dedicated to monographic brooms that we will see in a little bit. The second broom of the exhibition was called The Cultivated Landscape and presented a dialogue between two voices, the photographer Mario Giacomelli and the artist Riccardo Baruzzi, belonging to two different generations. Giacomelli was born in 1925 and died in the year 2000. Baruzzi was born in 1976, but both of them were engaging in different ways with the landscape, in particular the cultivated landscape where human intervention on the land is tangible. And this theme is really central to Giacomelli's photographic work, which you can see on the wall, from his early years in the 1950s until the end of his career. His gaze is primarily confined to the area around Senigallia, his hometown, which is in the Marche region, so again, central Italy, not far from the place where the other artist is also based. And the exhibition presented a selection from his vast body of work, including pieces from the series Metamorfosi della Terra, Metamorphosis of the Earth, and Presa di consapevolezza sulla natura, Awareness about nature. In Giacomelli's images, the agricultural landscape is transformed into a composition of abstract, high-contrasted geometries shaped over time by human labor. Sometimes intentionally composed with the collaboration of farmers and their tractors, but more often discovered. His landscapes are mostly captured from above, emphasizing the furrows in the earth. And while Giacomelli's photographs suggest human presence only indirectly, Baruzzi's work evoke it explicitly. His artistic vision is rooted in his place of origin, the province of Ravenna, particularly its rural landscape. We are in Emilia-Romagna, slightly north of the Marche region, where natural elements and human traces intertwine. And for Baruzzi, these landscapes serve as an exhaustible source of inspiration. His work reveals a profound interest in marginal, unspectacular places, embodying the concept of qualsiasità, which is really an untranslatable word coined by the writer Cesare Zavattini. It can be roughly translated as whateverness, used to describe the fascination with seemingly unremarkable context that upon closer observation reveal intricate details, narratives, and unexplored connections. In this exhibition, Baruzzi's focus is on scarecrows, simulacra of the human figure. They represent, the artists explain, quote, a roughness that belongs to me, an idea of raw, sustainable beauty that draws from the assembly technique I observed in workshops, among work sheds, and in the cultivated fields of the countryside. The following room was conceived as a diptych with the previous one. It was titled Cultivating the Landscape, as was dedicated to the theme of landscape, which has been the primary way in which the rural world has been represented in art through the canonized genre of landscape painting. To trace a possible genealogy of the rural landscape, works by artists from different generations and contexts are juxtaposed. So recent works are displayed alongside a selection of paintings from the collection of the Gallery of Modern Art Giovanni Carandente, which was the museum where I was working. So I selected a series of examples from the late 1940s and the late 1980s to reflect the evolution of the theme across different moments in 20th century art. And these works from the collection were presented in a display that was conceived by the artist Stefano Rienti, which incorporated into his Panorama, Palme and Ulivi a dust sheet, which you see on the wall, as a scenic backdrop for the room. Rienti is also the author of a carpet positioned on the floor, where the shadow of a tree on a grassy surface invites dialogue with the natural world behind the museum walls. Ariente's early focus on rural themes was shaped by his background in agricultural studies. In his photograph, digitally printed on microchenille, a field of poppies is disrupted by a plastic sheet spread onto the ground. Papaveri e teloni, poppies and tarpaulins, demystifies the idyllic imagery of the countryside, revealing its increasing industrialization, yet without completely negating its beauty. The title of the following room, Animated Lands, is inspired by Terra Animata, Animated Land by Luca Maria Patella, which is a 16mm film and a photographic series printed on canvas. In this work, two indicative human characters, like the artist called them, engage in measuring an agricultural plot of land using their bodies. The complex relationship between human beings, the rural environment, and nature is the center theme of this room, explored to the perspective of artists from different generations and backgrounds. In the post-war period, Pierpaolo Pasolini was one of the most insightful observers of the vanishing peasant world, a consequence of the profound anthropological transformation Italy underwent during the economic boom. His book, Le ceneri di Gramsci, Gramsci's Ashes, is reinterpreted by Elisabetta Benassi as the foundation of an installation where an artificial palm tree, germinating with ambiguous aggressiveness, emerges from Pasolini's legacy. The human-earth relationship takes another form in Senza titolo angolo, Untitled Corner by Massimo Bartolini, a photograph in which the artist portrays himself lying on the side, half submerged in the soil near his home. Here, Bartolini symbolically expresses the profound connection and the sense of belonging between humans and the land, the necessity of literally sinking our beings back into it. And a similar sense of interpenetration emerges in the sculptural series by Luca Francesconi, where slender bronze structure stylize human figures onto which fresh seasonal vegetables are grafted. The need for periodic replacement, the artist explains, create, quote, a sculpture that follows the rotation of crops and consequently the cycle of the seasons. The monographic room dedicated to Joseph Beuys presented a selection of materials related to the work he carried out in Abruzzo from the mid-1970s to the mid-1980s. In this context, Beuys integrated agriculture into his artistic practice as part of a broader exploration of the relationship between humans and reality, one that he sought to redefine according to new principles. Beuys first visited Abruzzo in 1973 and spent significant time there, supported by the friendship and patronage of Lucrezia de Domizio and her husband, Bubi Durini. Agriculture was at the center of this collaboration. During his stay at the couple's villa in San Silvestro Colli, in the province of Pescara, Beuys was captivated by the surrounding natural landscape. He also found an engaging scientific interlocutor in Bubi Durini, a trained biologist active in the agricultural sector. The first Incontro con Beuys, encounter with Beuys, took place in 1974 at Lucrezia de Domizio newly inaugurated gallery in Pescara, where he held a public discussion on creativity. 4 years later, he returned for another event, during which he proposed the creation of a Fondazione per la Rinascita dell'Agricoltura, Foundation for the Rebirth of Agriculture, an initiative aimed at collecting and sharing experimental approaches in the sector. The final chapter of Beuys' engagement in Abruzzo culminated in Operazione Difesa della Natura, Defense of Nature, in which his discourse expanded to include environmental concerns. The so-called Green Revolution, which spread globally between 1940s and 1970s, led to a radical transformation of the agricultural system. Mechanization, the extensive use of chemicals, and genetically selected plant varieties significantly increased production. However, this process also introduced contradictions and controversies related to environmental impact, biodiversity loss, resource exploitation, and not least labor conditions. In this context, some artists have proposed a perspective that merge critical reflection with poetic sensibility. And Paradoxes of the Green Revolution was the title of this room. It contained juxtaposed works by two artists, Elisabetta Benassi and Marzia Migliora. The first one, a couple of works encapsulate key moments in the history of agriculture, both before and after the Green Revolution. In this work, 459 meters of plowed field, the artist portrays herself plowing a field while pulling a pair of oxen. The action references a project she conceived in 2005 but was unable to realize due to the municipality of Rome's refusal. The plowing of a soccer field on Colle Oppio, a historically significant archaeological site above the Domus Aurea facing the Colosseum in Rome. Benassi reflects, quote, ultimately, the ban and what happened afterwards became part of the work. People imagined the action as if I had actually translated into reality, but the gesture remained in their imagination. In the end, perhaps, it was even more effective. A motor hoe by Officine Meccaniche Benassi stands at the center of the room, and playing with the hoe's name, the artist presents self-portrait at work, establishing an unexpected parallel between mechanized agriculture and artistic practice. Continuing the tradition of self-portraiture while personifying the object itself, Benassi playfully embodies oral notion of the artist as a machine. In her series Paradossi dell'abbondanza, Paradoxes of Abundance, Marzia Migliora explores the theme of the room. At first glance, her compositions created through drawing, collage, painting, and watercolor appear cheerful and almost advertising-like. However, upon closer inspection, one can see how the individual elements contribute to a mechanism that beneath its colorful facade reveals distortions and indeed paradoxes. The work focuses on one of Italy's main imported products, sugar. Migliora construct an intricate visual landscape tracing the journey of this commodity from colonial plantations to domestic consumption. By juxtaposing images of field laborers with portraits of white bourgeoisie women, she bridges distant geographies, cultural imaginaries, and historical periods. Rights, Myths, and Narrative was the title of the following room that was concentrated on agriculture as a source of images, metaphors, and symbols, which have shaped the representation of places, traditions, and ritual that mark human existence on Earth. This level of representation has always been intertwined with a symbolic dimension, whose complexity reflects the evolving relationship between humans and nature. Enzo Cucchi presents a landscape bordering on the realm of a dark visionary fairy tale, imbued with anxiety, skepticism, and a deep tragic irony towards history. Skulls, a recurring motif in Cucchi's work, emerge against the backdrop of a setting reminiscent of the Marche countryside, his place of origin. And yet, despite drawing from this familiar landscape, Cucchi paradoxically distances himself from it. Quote, I believe you have to move with the images you know, the ones that surround you, but in a natural way, end of quote. He also asserts, quote, I can't look around me. I'm interested in terms of race, flavor, and presence, but not in observing what surrounds me. Moira Ricci similarly finds inspiration in her homeland, the Maremma in Tuscany, blending its traditions, myths, and narratives with visions rooted in science fiction. These seemingly opposing imageries converge in Dove il cielo è più blu, where the sky is closer, a project spanning from 2014 to 2023, composed of photographs and videos. The exhibition brought together the first and the last chapter of this cycle, and the initial video is inspired by the legend of the Reaper Devil, in which a sharecropper is punished by the devil for failing to pay a farmer adequately. And 2 photographs depicts a peasant's last supper, constructed through artificial intelligence by assembling discarded images from the entire project. Here, ancient traditions are reimagined through modern technology, forging a dialogue between the past and the future. The second monographic room was dedicated to Gianfranco Baruchello and his Agricola Cornelia project, which spans 1973 to 1981, a pivotal chapter in the history of the expanded field. Baruchello arrived at Agricola Cornelia as part of an artistic inquiry shaped by his encounter with Marcel Duchamp, drawing essential inspiration from thought processes that spanned diverse themes, disciplines, and languages. In 1973, Baruchello and his partner moved to a large house with agricultural land on the northern outskirts of Rome in Via Santa Cornelia. Here he founded Agricola Cornelia, a company whose declared social purpose was cultivating the land. And this return to agriculture, motivated by a mix of personal and political reasons, became a laboratory, an experiment, and a platform for an artistic practice that transcended disciplinary boundaries, opening a dialogue on the relationship between art, life, economy, and agricultural activity. Baruchello described his approach as animated by the idea of, quote, revisiting certain myths, producing primary food goods, raising animals, practicing the land, and of course, continuing the work of an artist, so that each of these experiences is simultaneous, interchangeable, and interwoven. Agricola Cornelia was a complex project blending practical, intellectual, and imaginative dimensions. It served as a generator of ideas, themes, and questions, producing a cascade of associations and concepts that extended beyond agriculture, addressing topics such as land and food, but also touching on economics, politics, feminism, and the very definition of art itself. This section of the exhibition presented a series of paintings conceived within the context of Agricola Cornelia, which Baruchello considered byproducts, alongside documentary materials such as posters, photographs, and objects that evoke this all-encompassing experience of art and life.
Simone.
I'm late. Yeah, I will close.
You're right on time. Thank you.
Shall I close? Yeah. Okay. So just very quickly, the last 3 sections of the exhibition were concentrated on 3 systemic platforms in which artists work on their farming practices. So one is artist residencies. There were 3 examples of artist residencies in the countryside, and Pollinaria that I mentioned at the beginning was one of those. The second one are art farms, actually, in which in different ways artists were invited to produce works on the sites of these farms. And the last one was parks. So there was one example of this Parco d'Arte Vivente, Park of Living Art in Turin, which was opened by the artist Piero Gilardi, and which presented a series of exhibitions curated by Marco Scottini, in which, and I finish, the Okay. Sorry, I cannot find it, but a series of exhibition in which artists were challenging basically the neoliberal practices of agriculture. Thank you, and sorry for being late.
Thank you, Simone. No need to apologize. I appreciate all of y'all's offerings. We'll have a Q&A now. I have something that I can get us kick-started, unless somebody has a burning question in the crowd. No? Okay. Something that I was feeling throughout all y'all's conversation or researches and projects is something that Charli brought up about intimacy and reciprocity, and balance is something that I have been clinging to, from like wool shearing to the interpersonal relationality within Ren's work, and then this cultivation of land and the body's movement within the reflection of Simone's beautiful exhibitions and residencies. And the question lies of how have these approaches influence your embodiment and the ways that you are able to then approach your relationships with land or with non-humans or what have you. What do your bodies feel when you have engaged with this project prior, and what do you feel after? Like, can you locate like the balance between like, oh, this is something that I learned, maybe is the more simplified way.
I have kind of a small answer that I've been thinking about this actually a lot, and it's kind of silly, but I don't know, maybe it's not. I've been thinking a lot about the mice in my basement and the wasps in my yard, and I'm like, oh, you're me though. So I'm like having to relearn how to not be afraid of them and kill them, because I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah, I think for me, like through this research, which has been like it was all of my MA, and then after, the year and a half after, I've been like redefining a lot of things, like relationship, the word relationship is like very redefined for me now. So I think about relationship anarchy a lot now, and I think about like the way in which like romantic relationships or platonic relationships or relationship with land, like that can all be kind of on the same tier, right? And so when I live my life and I think about how I pursue my connections, a lot of my time is spent with friends, or it's spent with friends cleaning the river. We have River Justice is one of our mutual aid collectives in Reno. Because so the water starts in Lake Tahoe, it goes down the Truckee Rivershed and ends in Pyramid Lake, which is the Pyramid Lake Paiute Reservation, and it accumulates a whole bunch of trash. So we're actively trying to make sure that the trash doesn't make it to the reservation. And so the way that I spend my weeks is significantly different now, and what I prioritize in my day-to-day.
I mean, for me, in a way, this whole research started from an embodied dimension, in the sense that it was the encounter with this place, the artist residency that I mentioned, from the physical sensations that I had going into the countryside. And again, for positionality, I was born in an urban environment, spent most of my life in an urban environment, so the countryside was a place alien to me. But starting to visit this place, to experience this place physically, that set in motion a whole series of thoughts and experiences that eventually were translated into this research and the exhibition. And then also when we were talking before about the importance of trying to put together the more theoretical engagement with our subjects and a more physically embodied knowledge that we can get. I think it's also part what I try to do with my practice, that is moving between the theory and the curatorial work.
Thank you.
I could try to not use this and be more like you, but I'm gonna back myself up here. I have a little bit thought about domestication, not so much recently, but yeah, it's a really good question. And I think it kind of came up in an interesting way in the Sarah Souther piece that I mentioned, the sort of interconnection between cultural practices and environmental practices in indigenous cultures where people have been doing things such a way for so long that they are dependent on the way that they have shaped the land and vice versa. So like fire suppression now versus more indigenous practices of fire usage, and the way that cutting those practices off causes problems. Like maybe people were burning the land, and so the land wasn't naturally doing that. So in a way, they've domesticated that process. So I'm thinking about, sorry, that was very long. I'm thinking about the ways that like domestication is like a case study on the relationship, but actually everything is dependent on everything, which is really kind of wild.
Thanks for those. Whoa, now this is really loud now. I think I overcorrect. Thank you for those talks. I really learned a lot and enjoyed all of them. I had no idea about this art movement in Italy, so that was really fascinating, although I don't really have a question for that, sorry. For Ren, I want to hear more about the models of elemental thinking that you use theoretically, and then for Charli, you talked about Barad's agential materialism and also mentioned Tim Morton. And I don't think those two can inhabit the same space. I think they are fundamentally opposed at an incredibly deep level. Some of it coming from the fact that Barad is coming out of feminist and queer science studies, and that whole tradition of feminist thinking and feminist epistemology is so different. Whereas Morton is coming out of being a very privileged white male talking from that positionality. And more importantly, Barad uses Bohr's relata do not precede relations to argue that there are no relata, i.e. there is nothing that precedes a relationality, i.e. there can be no objects, whereas Morton's hyperobject is all about objects as contained different entities that he ponders from a position outside of them, like Ian Bogo's, what would it be like to be a computer cable, which I think is nonsense. And I think that those two just can't fit. So tell me how you fit them together.
Okay. So your question was on models for elemental thinking?
Yes.
Cool.
Of course I'd be interested in that.
Yeah. Well, so admittedly, this was the last time when I wrote this piece, it was like 2.5 years ago. So this was my first revisit back. So a lot of things are escaping my brain. But I wrote the piece in a like queerness and the elements course. And so I was pulling from, I'm pretty sure I pulled from the collection that we talked about earlier. And then I have like Papadopoulos et al. I don't have my notes with me, so I don't have the names of texts that I was reading. But yeah, I think a lot of it, so especially for that tie to asexuality, like asexuality is known as the invisible the invisible sexuality, and the task in the course was to like think about an element and then think about something. And so I was like, well, like what's invisible, and how can I think about that differently? And then I'd done like a lot of my studies were specifically within the field of asexuality studies because it's pretty sparse. I wanted to read as much as I could, and I was also really frustrated about being a spec at the time, so I like needed to read it all and then redefine it all. And so thinking about it through and with wind has been really, really healing. But yeah, this was like my first foray into elemental thinking. So actually, if you have recommendations, that would be sweet. Cool, okay.
Okay, thank you for that question that I feel was like almost a whole lecture in a question. And I learned from your question, and I don't have a great answer. But I guess I haven't read a ton of Morton yet. I haven't read Hyperobjects. I'm thinking specifically about the ecological thought. And it has been a minute since I've read it, but just kind of thinking about this ecology and the social, and kind of applying that sort of way of thinking. And then with Barad, definitely, yeah, I see the no relata aspect, and I'm kind of thinking about, I'm thinking about the underlyingness of that and how we're all the same thing. And yeah, maybe Morton just doesn't fit and I need to read more of their work. I guess I don't have anything better to say yet, but I appreciate you bringing it up, and I'm gonna dig in. Thank you.
I've heard people put them together before, and it just absolutely makes no sense to me.
That's really interesting. Okay, thank you.
Thank you. I have two questions, one for Charli, and it's, I think, much easier than the last one, and one for you, Simone. But I'll ask Charli's first. Very simple. What is the sheep doing when you shear them? Like, what do they know what's happening and are like cool with it? Are they trying to like wriggle out? What are they up to when you're doing that? And then for you, Simone, I'm really curious the specific period of history in Italy that you cited, this expanded fields art movement emerging from the sort of like 60s through the 80s. I understand to be a period of like really intense political conflict in Italy, and like for me personally, one of the like main sources of like contemporary insurrectionary anarchism came from the like operaismo like movement and like later Bonanno, and the fact that these two movements like run pretty parallel historically in the period. I'm hoping you could talk a little bit more about like to what extent they do or do not sort of like touch upon each other and like participate and interact. Yeah, thank you all three of you, though. It was three really great presentations.
I'll just answer real quick. The sheep don't love to be shorn. They're domesticated, but they're kind of in a way they're actually feral. So they generally live on large swaths of land out all year, and then you just go and gather them up, and then they're kind of freaked out. So sometimes they're fighting, unfortunately. But there's like a very specific, you get them in the position where they're sitting not on their tailbone, and then they kind of just go. And if you get fast enough, then it's pretty chill.
Thank you for your question. So the question is about the political side of the movement Arte Povera, I think you mean specifically. You mentioned operaismo. What was the second one?
I don't recall the name of the movement specifically, but the movement that Alfredo Bonanno came out of in the 80s, the insurrectionary anarchism.
Okay. Well, obviously there is a connection there historically. Arte Povera was coming out of that moment, which was politically very charged, as you mentioned. The movement coalesced officially in 1967, so that was 1 year before, you know, the explosion of the 68, and obviously it was somewhat aligned with the protests of the students and the workers at the time. It was very much the product of the theorization of Germano Celant, who was an art critic and also had put together these artists that were very different. So a lot of the criticism with Arte Povera is also the intellectual endeavor that it's behind this attempt of gathering artists that are very different. Some of them were more interested in the natural field, the forces of the physics, the chemistry, and reconnecting with nature. But on the other side, there was a more conceptual work by Alighiero Boetti or Giulio Paolini that are not represented here. So from one point of view, it can be very fictitious as a unitary movement. And it's also varied historically in the sense that it didn't have a fixed identity from the beginning. So Celant kind of continued to develop his thoughts about the movement through time. In 1968, it became way more political than it was at first. At first, it was underlining the more magical elements of this return to nature, and then it was responding. He was talking about a manifesto per una guerriglia. He was talking about guerrilla, so kind of aligning with what was happening at the time. Although it wasn't like a direct relationship with the political movements. It was more, I think, on an ideal level. Really, I don't. From what I know, from what I've seen, it was something that was reacting to the atmosphere, but it wasn't directly involved in political action. I don't know if that responded to your question. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you all for your presentations. So beautiful, so insightful. Ren, my question is for you. There was a point in your reading where you, and I could be paraphrasing, but perceived absences do not nullify them to nothingness. And that was so powerful and so moving. And so if you're open to sharing, I would love to hear how your relationship and practices with things that you identified as absent before and what that relationship is like now.
Yeah. Things have shifted a lot. Turns out when you work on something and try and deconstruct it, the way I identify has shifted a lot. Because, I was thinking, obviously, about asexuality in terms of that lack and the absence, and then being really frustrated about, like, oh, well, like, does that nullify, like, the rest of my relationships? Like, are they not? Like, what does my future look like, you know? And so I was like, well, I think these relationships obviously still have value and are deeply meaningful, and what does that look like, and what does cultivating that look like? So now I have these really deep platonic relationships So no one knows who I'm dating in Reno. It's kind of funny because they're like, but you act like this with everyone. But yeah, I think really just kind of thinking about, well, what can I build, what can be seen was transformational.
Okay. Anyone else? Well, I have a question. I'm going to sit down. I don't have the most well-formulated question, but I'm interested to hear more about the history of Joseph Beuys in your show and in his involvement in the Italian agricultural sector and countryside. I only am familiar with his work as a performance and conceptual artist, and also as a German artist. And so I'm interested in hearing about his work in Italy, and also about sort of the politics that he was involved with there and the reception of his person in those spaces.
Thank you for your question. Obviously, this was a super condensed presentation. But yeah, Beuys, as you know, was German, but he had a special relationship with Italy. It was probably the second country in which he was more active as an artist. And so this chapter of his work maybe is less known because of the marginality of the place. Abruzzo is a region that it's in central Italy geographically, but culturally it's more related to the south. It was part of the Regno delle Due Sicilie, so one of the southern state before the unification of Italy in 1861, and was really at the center of the work of Beuys in its engagement with agriculture in particular. He met this woman, Lucrezia de Domizio, who was, she defined herself as a cultural operator, a term very much 1970s. And she was married to a baron, so she had this, estate in the countryside. And Beuys, when he visited Italy, he was immediately captured by the natural environment. And I think he was also interested in the idea of working in a marginal space, so outside of the centers of contemporary art. They met in Naples because he was working with Lucio Amelio, the galleries of Naples, but started this relationship with Lucrezia and Bubi Durini, and came repeatedly in Abruzzo. So the first the first episode is the one that you see on the left, Incontro con Beuys. It was just a discussion that opened the gallery of Lucrezia de Domizio. Discussion as part of Beuys' work, as you probably know. Then there was another discussion in 1978, which was this proposal of the Foundation for the Rebirth of Agriculture. And he presented also the red book, Third Way, the initiative to promote the Third Way, and created a series of editions of works, also revolving around agriculture, so agricultural tools, for example, that he created as multiples as he was doing. But then he started what was fascinating for me, the idea of agriculture as a practice, as an artistic practice. So this was the first real operation that happened in the estate of Lucrezia de Domizio. It was a cultivation, an organic cultivation, basically, which in 1975 was not obviously as mainstream as it is today. And the thinking of Beuys was very much influenced by Rudolf Steiner, the German philosopher. So he was following a lot his thoughts about the re-establishment of a natural dimension. And then as he moved on, what is fascinating about Beuys is double work, both on the theoretical level and on the practical of the cultivation. He also had bought an estate in Holland and started to grow and cultivate there. And so when he saw this possibility in Abruzzo, the operations became bigger and bigger and culminated in this final chapter of his work, the Operazione Difesa della Natura, which again was like a multi-pronged attempt revolving around this paradise plantation that was a cultivation of 7,000 species of engendered plants in Bolognano, a small town in the province of Pescara. But then when Boyce was working, obviously he oversaw a whole series of operations. So for example, the creation of these editions of wine bottles, but also olive oil. Those were all products coming from the land of Bubi Durini. And also the plantation of the first oak, the Italian oak, in 1984. And that was his last chapter because he died at the beginning of 1986. So multiple waves and multiple works. Yeah.
I think that's that. Any lingering questions? Jade, did you want to come up and talk about the workshop that's about to happen after this? Great. Can we get another round of applause for the presenters? Yeah. Thank you all so much.
Terrific panel. Thank you, y'all. I am the chair of low residency creative writing, and at 4 o'clock, Stephanie Adams Santos is going to be facilitating a somatic writing workshop and making workshop. She will be bringing us into our bodies. Stephanie's very interested in dreams, so there'll probably be some dream stuff happening, and I know that she will be slowing us down, and it'll be wonderful. So I hope you can attend. That's at 4 o'clock. Thanks, y'all.